and a half. And again, we will be adapting to the schedule because obviously we started a little bit late, so we will adjust our schedule accordingly. We will be having a discussion about what it means to have or to aspire towards an innovation-ready or an innovation-friendly food regulatory framework. What does that mean exactly? And in fact, we welcome your perspectives about that. And I would like to say that this is an effort on our part to start even a much more thorough training initiative around enabling innovation through regulation. So something that will take probably a course of at least 12 hours. But at this point in time, we're going to give you the teaser of that course. And perhaps, in fact, this could benefit from your experience and your expertise as well. So we're going to be starting with some recorded interventions. You're going to be seeing me again, but in another form. And hopefully we're going to have some discussions as well organized throughout these interventions. Okay, so a little bit of lectures, presentations, and discussions. And we're going to start with the first segment. To this learning series on food innovation and innovation-ready food regulatory systems. When we think about food regulation, our first instinct is often to think about food safety and consumer protection as well as compliance. And rightly so. These remain the primary responsibilities of every food regulatory authority. However, the environment in which we operate is changing rapidly. Today, food regulators are increasingly expected not only to protect consumers, but also to create the conditions that allow safe innovation to reach the market. Innovation is no longer simply a matter of commercial opportunity. It has become a strategic response to major societal challenges: food security, nutrition, sustainability, climate resilience, and economic development. In this context, enabling responsible innovation is becoming a legitimate public policy objective alongside the traditional objectives of consumer protection and fair practices in trade. Food systems are facing pressures unlike those experienced in previous generations. Global population growth continues to increase demand for food. Climate change is altering production conditions in many parts of the world. Water, land, and other natural resources are becoming more constrained, and consumers are seeking healthier, more sustainable, and more personalized food choices. At the same time, scientific and technological capabilities are advancing at an unprecedented pace. According to the FAO Food Safety Foresight Report, climate change, population growth, changing dietary patterns, global trade, migration, and technological innovation are among the major drivers shaping the future of agri-food systems and food safety. These forces create both challenges and opportunities for food regulators. Innovation in food production systems is no longer discretionary. It is, in fact, not occurring in isolation. It is a direct and indispensable response to these global pressures. FAO has undertaken extensive foresight work to understand how agri-food systems may evolve over the coming decades. The conclusion in the report is that agri-food systems are entering a period of profound transformation. We are witnessing the emergence of new food sources, new production systems, digital technologies, artificial intelligence applications, personalized nutrition, circular economy approaches, and entirely new business models in the delivery of food production systems. These developments create opportunities to improve food security, sustainability, and health outcomes. However, they also raise important questions for food regulators. How do we assess safety when products have little or no history of consumption? How do we evaluate technologies that did not exist when our regulations were written? How do we maintain public confidence while remaining open to innovation? These are precisely the questions that innovation-ready regulatory systems must be able to address. One of the clearest manifestations of food innovation is the search for new food sources. Historically, humanity has relied on a relatively limited number of crops and animal species for most of its food supply. Today, there is growing interest in diversifying food sources to improve resilience, nutrition, and sustainability. Examples include plant-based proteins, algae, seaweeds, insects, precision fermentation products, cellular cultivated foods, and the rediscovery of underutilized traditional crops, identifying extracts with health benefits and functions. The foresight exercises on new food sources and production systems identified dozens of emerging innovations that could significantly reshape food systems over the next 20 to 30 years. Many of these innovations are motivated by the need to produce more food with fewer resources while reducing the environmental impact. When discussing food innovation, we often immediately think about novel foods. However, innovation extends far beyond novel ingredients. Innovation can occur through new production systems, new technologies, new processing methods, the discovery of new functionality to known or new ingredients, and even new approaches to delivering health benefits. For example, artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to identify new ingredients and optimize food formulations. Precision fermentation is producing proteins that were previously difficult to obtain. Personalized nutrition is creating opportunities to tailor food products to individual needs and choices. And the regulatory challenge is therefore becoming broader than managing a few novel products or novel ingredients. It is about ensuring that the regulatory systems remain fit for purpose in a continuously evolving innovation landscape. It is important to remember that innovation is not only about managing risk. Innovation also creates opportunities. For consumers, innovation may lead to healthier foods, improved nutritional profiles, greater choice, and better access to products aligned with consumers' values. For governments, innovation can contribute to food security, to sustainability objectives, economic diversification, and also job creation. For industry, innovation supports competitiveness, investment, and access to new markets. Innovation should not therefore be viewed solely as a regulatory challenge. It should be viewed as an opportunity that can help address some of the most pressing issues facing food systems today. At the same time, innovation inevitably introduces uncertainty. When a product has been consumed for generations, regulators can often rely on extensive experience and historical knowledge. When a product is new, that certainty may not exist. Regulators must determine whether the product is safe, what evidence is needed, whether existing frameworks are adequate, and whether additional oversight may be warranted. This is why novel foods and emerging technologies often receive a heightened regulatory attention. The challenge is to manage uncertainty in a manner that remains science-based, proportionate to risk, and transparent while avoiding unnecessary barriers to innovation. Regulatory systems that fail to evolve can create their own risks. When regulatory frameworks are unclear, unpredictable, or outdated, innovation may be delayed or diverted elsewhere. Investors become reluctant to commit resources. Companies may prioritize markets that offer clearer pathways, and consumers may experience delayed access to beneficial products. We increasingly see situations where the same ingredient receives approval in one jurisdiction while remaining inaccessible in another. The result is, in fact, fragmentation, duplication of effort, increased costs, and reduced efficiency. And in many cases, the challenge is not the absence of safety standards. The challenge is the absence of a regulatory pathway that is clear enough, that is predictable, and that can accommodate innovation effectively. Now, a common misconception is that innovation-friendly regulation means weaker regulation. Nothing could be further from the truth. Innovation-friendly systems must remain firmly grounded in public health protection. The difference is that they seek to achieve regulatory objectives through approaches that are primarily based on science, that are risk-based, transparent, predictable, adaptable, and maintaining the collaborative stance of food regulatory engagement. Such systems maintain high standards of safety while reducing the unnecessary uncertainty and reducing duplication. In other words, innovation-friendly regulation is not about lowering the bar. It is about improving the way the system must operate. And if there is one message that I would like to take away from this particular session, it is this. Food innovation has become a strategic issue for nations and for humanity, not only for regulators. The future of food systems will be shaped by new products, by new technologies, new production systems, and new consumer expectations. And food regulators must have a critical role to play, not only as protectors of the food supply, but also as enablers of safe, responsible, and trustworthy innovation. The challenge before us is not whether innovation will happen. It will. The challenge is whether our regulatory systems are prepared to guide it effectively. So, if innovation has become a strategic objective, what exactly does an innovation-friendly food regulatory framework look like? This is what we will explore in the subsequent sessions. So that's segment one. And just wanted to let you know that we're trying this exercise right now. We're going to be producing these capsules in different languages. So there will be an equivalent in French and an equivalent in Arabic, and maybe at some point an equivalent in Spanish as well. So we'll be covering, and maybe in Portuguese in order to cover all AFRAF languages. I would like to take a couple of take-home messages here. And I would like to ask you, one of the key messages that I've heard, and I would like also to hear you to tell me what you retained out of this, is that innovation does not mean necessarily novel food. So I'm going to give you an example. We live in an environment where many countries are developing salt reduction strategies, right? Salt, sodium, is a contributor to high blood pressure. High blood pressure is a risk factor of cardiovascular disease. So I'm going to be looking at salt-reduced foods, right? When I reduce salt from food, what happens? Water activity of food basically increases. If I increase the water activity, what will I have? New risks of bacteria, right? So what do I need to think about? Potentially bacteria inhibitors. Bacteria inhibitors, for example, one of the bacteria that is actually the most sneaky, particularly, and that loves cold, Listeria monocytogenes, as an example. So basically, I would be looking at new additives that will be trying to reduce bacteria growth to compensate the fact that my water activity has increased. That's innovation. And that's a new additive, for example. And I need to find a way, a pathway, for example, bacteriophages, to be able to access the market. If my regulatory system is weak when it comes to acceptance of new additives, that particular innovation will not come in. Another example, sugar reduction strategies. We're all looking for that. We're actually trying to introduce products that meet consumers' demand and still actually lowering the sugar intake. So I'm going to be looking at low-caloric sweeteners, including artificial sweeteners, whether they are from natural or non-natural sources. Again, if I do not have a system in place that would allow me to accommodate this potential access into market, or that can have some repercussions related to perceptions, false information dissemination, etc. These will be barriers to trade. And this is what the regulatory system needs to be able to be ready to face if we are to address these particular issues, and if we want to have what we call an innovation-ready regulatory regime. So again, innovation-ready also, we introduce some notions related to flexibility. But flexibility should mean adaptability. It doesn't mean lowering the bar. It means simply that the system is robust enough, but must be adapting to change. And that's essentially now what we're going to be seeing in the next capsule, because one of the key outputs from the beginning here is that if I do not have a robust regulatory regime to address regular food issues, obviously I will not be ready to address innovation, anything new. So addressing innovation should start with addressing any potential weaknesses in the food control systems. And we'll go to the next segment. Predictable and grounded in science, they create the confidence needed for innovation, investment, and consumer trust to flourish. When discussing innovation-friendly regulation, many people immediately think about novel foods, alternative proteins, precision fermentation, or other emerging technologies. However, innovation readiness does not begin with novel food regulations. It begins by having a strong and credible food control system. A regulatory authority must first be able to perform its core functions effectively, protecting consumers, ensuring fair practices in the food trade, and maintaining confidence in the food supply. If a system struggles to deliver these basic objectives consistently, it will inevitably struggle to manage innovation as well. Innovation-friendly systems are therefore not separate systems. They are robust regulatory systems that already function well and have earned the trust of consumers, of industry, and policymakers. In many respects, innovation readiness is simply the next stage in the evolution of a mature and effective food control system. Every innovation introduces some degree of uncertainty. A new ingredient, a new process, or a new production technology may raise questions that have not been encountered before. The role of the regulator is not to eliminate uncertainty entirely. Rather, the regulator's role is to manage uncertainty in a structured and science-based manner. This is precisely why risk analysis is so important. Risk analysis provides the internationally recognized framework for food regulatory decision-making. It consists of the three interconnected components that are risk assessment, where we evaluate the scientific evidence, risk management, where we determine the appropriate regulatory response, and risk communication, where we engage stakeholders and explain decisions transparently at every stage of the decision-making process. A system that is grounded in risk analysis can evaluate both traditional foods and innovative foods using the same scientific principles. The question is not whether the product is new. The question is whether the available evidence supports its safety and whether any risks can be appropriately managed. This is what creates regulatory confidence and ultimately public and consumer confidence. Once a strong food control system is in place, several characteristics become particularly important for supporting innovation in the way the system is operated. The first element is transparency. Innovators need to understand how decisions are made and what information is expected. And in that regard, they are at the same level as any food business operator. The second is predictability. Companies and investors need a reasonable understanding of the regulatory pathway, meaning what way will allow market access, what type of level of oversight, pre-market oversight, decisions that need to be following some rules that are set with certain level of monitoring, as well as the requirements associated with the entry into market and the expected process. The third aspect is the science basis. Any decision in relation with novel ingredients or innovative processes should be driven by evidence rather than perceptions or assumptions. And the fourth is efficiency. This means that we're not lowering the standards, but we are simply delivering the regulatory functions in an efficient way that creates clear timelines and that allows a clear pathway, including in the way the paperwork is handled. The fifth aspect is proportionality. Regulatory requirements should reflect the level of risk that is being addressed. And finally, adaptability. Scientific knowledge, technologies continue to evolve, and regulatory systems must be capable of evolving with them. When these characteristics are present, regulators maintain high levels of consumer protection while creating an environment that would be considered to encourage responsible innovation and therefore investment. When we speak about innovation-ready food regulatory systems, it is important to recognize that innovation readiness, again, does not begin with novel foods or novel technologies. It begins with the strength of the underlying food control systems. The first layer of that is a strong regulatory foundation. And this is based on the fact that the food control system is anchored in a modern food legislation, supported by fit-for-purpose regulations and associated guidance. Together, they create the legal certainty, they empower the competent authorities, and they provide the predictability that innovators, investors, and consumers need. At the heart of this foundation lies risk analysis. Risk analysis should not be viewed simply as a technical tool, but as an overarching framework that guides the regulatory decision-making. It ensures that decisions are science-based, transparent, proportionate, and consistent through the integration of the outputs of the risk assessment, overlaying the various parameters that may help formulate risk management options, and therefore the choice of the instrument that is most appropriate to manage the risk, and risk communication, meaning communicating throughout the process with all partners and stakeholders involved and impacted. This foundation must also be supported by strong governance arrangements. Effective collaboration between regulators, public health authorities, academia, industry, and consumers help build the trust. It also improves the quality of the decision-making and ensures that the regulatory system remains responsive to emerging challenges and also to opportunities. Finally, none of these functions without capable institutions and scientific capacity can thrive and can actually operate. Competent authorities need the expertise, the resources, the data systems, the scientific networks. All of this is required to evaluate the evidence and to manage the risk effectively. It is only when these foundational elements are in place that we can have a regulatory system that can move confidently towards the next stage of innovation readiness and safely enable new food new ingredients, new health claims, as well as new opportunities for economic growth. The second layer of innovation readiness is the adoption of good regulatory practices. Once a strong food control system is in place, the quality of the regulatory process itself becomes a critical determinant of whether innovation is encouraged or discouraged. This is where the OECD's principles of good regulatory governance become highly relevant. These principles emphasize that regulatory decisions should be transparent, evidence-based, predictable, accountable, and developed through meaningful stakeholder engagement. Transparency allows stakeholders to understand how the decisions are made. Predictability, which, by the way, we define by the basis that if we change positions between the regulator and the regulated party, because we are using the same decision-making process, using the same data and the same information, we should arrive at the same conclusion. Therefore, predictability, which is stemming from the application of risk analysis, would ensure that innovators know what is expected, what evidence is required, and how regulatory decisions are formulated and therefore will be reached. Accountability strengthens confidence that decisions are taken in a consistent fashion and in the public interest. And stakeholder engagement ensures that regulators benefit from the knowledge, the expertise, and the perspectives of the industry, because at the end of the day, the industry is the one that develops the novelty, the innovative processes, and that tends to be in possession of most of the information related to them, including the information that supports their safety assessment. This is generally supported by information provided by academia, including also public health professionals and even by consumers themselves throughout the regulatory process. Together, these practices help create trust. And trust is one of the most important currencies of innovation. When innovators trust the regulatory system, they are more willing to invest. When consumers trust the regulatory system, they are more willing to accept innovation. And when regulators engage openly and transparently with stakeholders, they create an environment where innovation can be evaluated objectively and responsibly. In that sense, innovation-friendly regulation is not simply about regulatory pathways. It is about creating a trustworthy regulatory environment where science, dialogue, transparency, and accountability work together to support both public health and innovation. The third layer moves beyond the foundations of good regulation and focuses specifically on what it takes to enable innovation. At this stage, innovators need more than trust in the regulatory system. They need a clear understanding of the pathway to market. An innovation-ready framework provides clarity on how innovative products will be assessed, whether through pre-market review, a post-market oversight model, or a combination of both. The key is that the pathway is understandable, clear, predictable, and proportionate to the level of risk presented. For very low risk products, for example, or very low risk innovations, using a pre-market oversight may be a waste of resources. For innovations that present more risks, more uncertainties, less knowledge, less history, a pre-market oversight may be most appropriate. A second critical element is early dialogue between innovators and regulators. Early engagement helps clarify expectations, identify evidence requirements, reduce uncertainty, and avoid costly delays later in the process. It allows innovation and regulation to evolve together rather than in isolation. Third, innovation-ready systems are adaptive. They recognize that science and technology evolve faster than regulations and therefore create mechanisms that allow regulatory frameworks to respond to emerging products, technologies, and new sources of evidence. OECD work increasingly emphasizes the importance of adaptive, anticipatory, and flexible regulatory approaches to support innovation while maintaining public policy objectives. Finally, and perhaps one of the most powerful tools available today is what we call regulatory reliance. No regulator can be an expert in everything, and no country should need to duplicate scientific work that has already been conducted by trusted authorities. Innovation-ready systems are increasingly open to leveraging assessments, evaluations, and regulatory decisions made by trusted regulators or qualified third parties. Of course, we cannot trust or we cannot rely unless there are clearly defined criteria associated with the acceptance of these decisions, including the enabling elements that we mentioned, and particularly transparency and clear governance arrangements. This, in fact, does not mean that we are outsourcing the decisions, because the regulatory authority of a given country remains the accountable authority for its final decision. But it means that making those decisions will be using in a smart way the global scientific expertise. It helps to reduce duplication, and it improves efficiency and accelerates access to safe innovation. In many ways, this third layer is where regulatory modernization translates into practical innovation outcomes through clear pathways supported by early dialogue, by adaptive frameworks, and by regulatory reliance. Ultimately, innovation-friendly regulation is not about creating a separate set of rules for innovative products, nor is it about lowering regulatory standards. Rather, it is a natural progression and a natural outcome of a mature and well-functioning food control system. When a regulatory system is grounded in science, guided by risk analysis, operates transparently, predictably, and efficiently, it creates the confidence that innovators, investors, and consumers need. When that system is capable of adapting to scientific and technological advances, it can accommodate innovation without compromising its primary responsibility, which is the protection of public health. In other words, innovation readiness is not a departure from good regulation. It is, in fact, an expression of good regulation at its best. Okay, now we're going to stop listening to the clone and you're going to listen to the original version. And I would like to discuss a few points that were made. First of all, you've heard a reference in the discussion there, and the reference of good regulation that could be applied to food regulation. The reference that you've heard a lot is OECD. Can anybody tell me what OECD is and why OECD is preoccupied with regulation? Briefly. The acronym. Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's an organization of economic cooperation and development. And I'm insisting on this. So you see, economic development cannot happen without good regulation. So, and this is really an important notion. Having a good regulatory regime is a foundation for any aspect of development. And that's a reference that we will explore. And by the way, again, here I'm sharing, my background. I have worked in a regulatory agency in Canada for about 20 years. And believe me, we had so many plans of what we call, smart regulations and good regulations. And we always refer to OECD for that guidance. And we're going to spend the next segments trying to speak about what it means. Now, the other reference that is mentioned in order to create a robust food regulatory regime, which again, I go back and remind us that developing innovation-friendly regulatory regime doesn't mean developing a new regime. It's strengthening what we have. It's making sure that what we have works well. What is the other reference that was mentioned? Many codex contact points over here. So, codex. Can you give me a codex text that is foundational for the operations of food control systems? A foundational text. Remember actually that little pyramid that I presented that I use all the time? You know, a good food control system is a system that is anchored in robust legislation and associated regulation, where decisions are made on the basis of risk analysis and that is supported with collaboration and good governance. See, I sleep repeating this. You know, as a regulator, you practically sleep repeating this. And that is further supplemented with good institutions, allowing good operations and a strong scientific foundation. That's that pyramid, by the way. Okay, so we're going to examine that text specifically. This is, and here, okay, I'm biased. I mean, not unbiased. Basically, I guess I have a flaw in the sense that I'm teaching this, so of course I will have to remember it. It's CXG 82 2013. I don't expect you to remember that, but maybe at the end you will. But there are a few features of the food control system that I kept repeating, some adjectives that I kept saying, adjectives or nouns. A good food control system should be, give me, nouns or adjectives. Predictable. Give me other ones. Transparent. Another one. Science-based. Another one. Risk-based. Okay. Adaptable. If I take risk-based and try to explain it a little bit further, proportionate. Proportionate. Risk-based means proportionate. So again, the example that I always give my students is the following. We do not kill a mosquito with a hammer. Because you have the mosquito, you have the hammer. The hammer is strong force, right? So you're putting an extreme amount of force to kill the mosquito. Your chance to create a hole on the surface is much bigger than catching the mosquito. So basically, you will have unforeseen consequences, and the mosquito, which is the risk, is gone. You use a large surface, you apply very light force, you catch the mosquito. It's an action that is proportionate to the risk. Okay? And in this particular case, if we translate that in innovation, and I will repeat that later, if I am looking at something that has a low level of risk, why am I creating a pre-market oversight? You know what I mean by pre-market oversight? Basically, everybody has to come to me. I have to review it. I have to take the time. I have to spend resources. And then I have to say yes or no. And I have to repeat that every time and every time and every time and every time. And this is low risk. Is that actually the use of good resources? And I'm leaving other things unattended? That's actually killing the mosquito with a hammer. Okay? Something that requires attention, that contains uncertainty, that requires the generation of new evidence, yes, I might actually require a pre-market assessment for that type of thing. Okay? And because I will be requiring that, and because also I acknowledge that I do not live alone, and that I may not have the resources to do that, to do everything alone, I can use other parties' information, other parties' results. And that's what we will use in terms of regulatory reliance. Now, I'm going to actually explore the codex reference, and I'm going to go quickly to the little presentation that we have here. And we're going to discuss CXG 82 2013. So actually, at the end of the day today, and I will ask you tomorrow, so you will be dreaming tonight with CXG about CXG 82 2013. Okay? I'm repeating so many times that you will end up doing it. So we'll go to the So you see, this is the text in question. Oh my gosh, no, I have a, yeah. So we'll see. You know, I have a history with these things. They never work with me. So we'll try to see if it does. So, wow, amazing. So that's so it's working. So the title of the text is Principles and Guidelines for National Food Control Systems. Basically, these are 13 principles that were developed by CC-FIX that are considered as the foundation for any robust food control system. Now, we will not discuss the order of the principles, frankly, because as you know, codex texts are written with groups. So you need to have consensus. I mean, if I was writing this alone, I would be using a different logic. You know, for example, they use the legal foundation as principle number 11, legal foundation. That's principle number 11. I would have started with that, but that's me, okay? So now what I highlighted in red are the elements of the principles that apply to innovation and that we mentioned previously. First, your primary objective of any action, including to vet innovation, is the protection of consumers. That does not change. You know, your primary objective is the protection of consumers. That stays. Third principle, transparency. Any decision that we make should be transparent, meaning I share the basis upon which my decision is made, including the information I use to arrive at the decision. 4, the roles and responsibilities are clearly identified. What does this mean? It means that if you are an industry and presenting me with a file on innovation that I need to give you a decision on, I need to understand very clearly what I need to provide you with. Okay, so the roles and responsibilities are very clearly defined and the requirements are clearly identified and shared. Consistency and impartiality. I cannot be making a decision today about this and a similar type of product, and I will be taking a different decision simply because I like product A and I don't like product B. That applies to food innovation as well. Or, you know what? And this happens, believe me, I mean, even because we are humans, right? Regulatory regimes are not operated by robots or by artificial intelligence. Maybe they will be at some point, but right now they are operated by humans. And you know what characterizes us humans? We have emotions. And because we have emotions, we have perceptions. And because we have perceptions, there are things that we like and there are things that we don't like. So I have, for example, somebody, and this happened to me in my regulatory career. You know, one of my regulatory staff come to me and he say, you know what, we should delay this decision because I don't like this application. But you know what? It's not your role to like or not like. Does the application fulfill the requirement? Is there a safety concern? Is there a problem with the information provided? Is there a problem with fulfilling the regulatory, legislative requirements and so on? If the answer is no to all of this, whether you like it or not, you are obligated to render a decision that is in line with the findings of that process. And by the way, what is that process? That's risk analysis, because you follow the methodology. So perceptions and emotions should not be a factor in the regulatory decision-making, and that's what we mean by consistency and impartiality if we want to apply it to innovation. 6, risk-based. Basically, that's the application of the risk analysis principles, risk-based and science-based. 10, recognition of other systems. This is a recognition that basically no regulator and no country is an island. If you are doing something or you are preoccupied with something, there's probably another regulator that is doing the same thing. And that's why I'm going to give you an example. In Australia, for example, they decided, because the regulatory resources are constrained, they decided that they will be using the decisions of the United States when it comes to food contact material. Does this mean basically that they relinquish entirely their sovereignty? No, they are making the decision.
but they are using because they trust the system that is being applied by the US Food and Drug Administration. They decided to use the results. Doesn't mean that they copy paste without thinking, by the way. They scrutinize every decision. Okay, but that's regulatory reliance. In most recent years, Canada and Australia agreed that for foods derived from biotechnology, they will be having a recognition of each other's decisions. So you don't have to apply in both countries. When you apply in one country, you have a high likelihood to be accepted in the other one. And this is definitely an enabler to innovation, if we reach that. And I say this because Africa, with the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area, you as regulators can engineer a system that can allow that regulatory reliance. It is within our hands, your hands, to be able to drive that. Legal foundation, I mentioned that. If you do not have the empowerment that comes from legislation, you will be not able to render your decisions. And finally, 12, harmonization, which is the essence of what Codex stands for. So we try, of course, to follow Codex principles in rendering those decisions. Now, when we speak about clear roles and responsibilities, we speak and we want to mention that me as a regulator, I have the responsibility to give the requirements of access to markets, whether they are post-market, meaning the rules that need to be fulfilled for a product to access the market. For example, contaminants levels that should not be exceeded, labeling requirements that need to be fulfilled, any type of limitations on certain substances that may be added directly or indirectly. Indirect substances, for example, would be pesticides or incidental additives or technological agents. Food labeling requirements need to be very clear. Also, if there are any restrictions on the conditions of production, I need to know them. And if there are rules that I need to consider as a producer about marketing the product or putting a claim, I need to know those requirements. So the regulator has the responsibility to clarify those rules and those requirements. So the key prerequisites, because if we now use the statement that having an innovation ready or an innovation friendly food regulatory system starts with the robustness of the food regulatory system itself. We need to have at least 3 of these ingredients. Clear guidance on requirements that are very explicit and transparent. We need to have the scientific capacity, but also the food regulatory capacity to address any needs of safety assessment for foods and processes. And I need also to have an institution that functions. Basically, I need to have operations that are well established. Any comments or questions before we move to the next segment? You're still with me, by the way, nobody's sleeping? No requirements for caffeine intake? Added caffeine intake? No? We're good? Okay, then we spoke about OECD. Let's unpack those OECD recommendations.
Public policy objectives, including the protection of consumers and the ability to have an enabling and a fair environment for food trade. However, for regulations to be effective, they must be designed carefully. Regulations that are overly rigid, unnecessarily burdensome, or that create avoidable barriers can impede economic growth and discourage innovation. The objective is therefore to develop regulations that continue to manage risks effectively while creating an environment that supports investment, innovation, and development. The OECD recognized that adopting regulations is not enough. Governments must also periodically examine the quality and the performance of these regulations. This means assessing not only the regulations themselves, but also the processes used to develop, implement, evaluate, and revise them over time. To support this, the OECD encourages the development of administrative and management systems that promote good decision making, guided by three key principles: efficiency, flexibility, and transparency. The OECD also reminds governments that regulations do not operate in isolation. They can affect investment, decisions, they can influence international trade, and can create impacts beyond national borders. For this reason, regulators are encouraged to consider these broader effects when designing regulatory measures. To support this process, the OECD developed a regulatory decision-making checklist that helps governments assess whether regulations are achieving their objectives while minimizing unnecessary burdens and unintended consequences. Modern regulatory systems are expected to deliver more than control and compliance alone. In the food sector, regulations will always have the primary objective of protecting consumers and supporting fair practices in trade. However, when designed and implemented effectively, they can also facilitate market access. They can reduce unnecessary regulatory burden and support innovation. They can enable adaptation to new technologies and therefore strengthen economic competitiveness. The key point is that these additional benefits should not come at the expense of consumer protection. Rather, they should be achieved through what we consider to be better regulation. This is why the foundations we discussed earlier are so important. Decision-making grounded in risk analysis, supported by science, implemented transparently and predictably, applied proportionately to the level of risk, and developed through meaningful stakeholder engagement. Combined with a commitment to continuous improvement, these elements create a regulatory environment that protects consumers while also enabling innovation and growth. Now, to help governments improve the quality of regulations, the OECD developed a reference checklist for regulatory decision making. The checklist supports a structured approach to collecting and analyzing the information, conducting consultations, and carrying out systematic evaluations of regulatory measures. Its purpose is to help ensure that regulations achieve their objectives while minimizing the unintended consequences, including the unnecessary burdens on small and medium enterprises. At the same time, it promotes the consistent application of common principles for sound regulatory decision-making across OECD countries. To support a systematic assessment of regulatory quality, the OECD developed this series of key questions that governments are encouraged to consider when they design the regulations. These include: is the problem clearly defined? Is the government intervention justified? Is regulation the most appropriate tool, or could non-regulatory measures achieve the same objective of risk management? Is there a clear legal basis for action and intervention? And do the expected benefits outweigh the costs of the development and implementation of the regulations? Collectively, these questions help ensure that regulations are proportionate, justified, effective, and aligned with the principles of good regulatory governance. The second group of OECD questions focuses on the quality and practical impact of the regulations. Regulators are encouraged to consider whether the effects of a regulation are distributed evenly and fairly across society, whether the requirements are clear, consistent, understandable, and accessible to those who must comply with these regulations, and whether affected stakeholders have been adequately consulted and engaged. Finally, a critical question is whether the regulations are realistically enforceable and likely to be complied with, because even the best designed regulation cannot achieve its objectives if it is not understood, if it is not accepted, if it is not achievable and implemented in practice, including for its enforceability status. The application of these principles has led to the development of robust regulatory frameworks for areas such as food additives and health claims, where pre-market approvals are required. These systems rely on clear, science-based and evidence-based decision-making processes that are transparent to all stakeholders and that are also inspired and following Codex principles. They also incorporate mechanisms for stakeholder engagement and, where appropriate, recourse or review processes, ensuring that decisions remain fair, transparent, and accountable, with the possibility of questioning the outcome of the decision and providing evidence that could potentially be considered in order to change the course of the decision-making process. Finally, the choice of a regulatory instrument itself should be based on a careful analysis of whether regulation is the most appropriate tool to achieve the intended objective. One practical example of instrument choice analysis is deciding whether a food should be managed through post-market or pre-market oversight. In principle, government intervention should be proportionate to risk. Therefore, most foods are regulated through post-market measures, meaning that as long as established requirements are met, products can enter the market without prior authorization. However, when uncertainty or risk increases, the level of oversight may also increase. For example, infant formula is subject to pre-market oversight because it is consumed by a highly vulnerable population and often as a sole source of nutrition. Similarly, foods resulting from innovation may warrant pre-market review when uncertainty is higher, allowing regulators to assess safety before market entry. Food labeling measures can be important risk management tools as well, and in some cases may be considered sanitary measures. However, their use should be justified through a risk-based approach. First, there must be a clearly identified risk or concern. Second, it must be demonstrated that providing information to consumers through labeling on food products is an effective and proportionate means of managing that risk and supporting informed decision-making. Mandatory labeling requirements should only be introduced when they are deemed to be clearly justified by the level of risk and when they are deemed necessary, as they occupy part of the limited label space available to food producers. When used as a risk management tool, labeling must be clear, accurate, non-misleading, and unambiguous. It should directly address the risk being managed and be presented in a way that is legible, understandable, and useful to consumers in making informed choices, informed decisions to protect their health. An important principle when using food labeling as a risk management tool is that food labels are generally intended to inform rather than to warn. If every inherent hazard associated with food ingredients required a warning, including food components, by the way, virtually every food product would carry warning statements that are endless. There wouldn't be enough space on the label to do so. Instead, labeling provides consumers with the information they need to manage their own risks from food, and that's actually applicable for food labeling. For example, foods containing aspartame indicate the statement contains phenylalanine, This is meant for individuals with phenylketonuria, and this is meant to inform them that the food in question may not be suitable to their health. The statement used is an information statement, contains phenylalanine, and not a health warning. In a similar fashion, allergen labeling identifies the presence of allergens such as peanuts, rather than describing the potential health consequences of consuming the allergenic ingredient by the allergic consumer. This reflects a fundamental difference between food labeling and therapeutic product labeling, with food labels focusing primarily on providing the information to consumers such that they can make an informed choice. To summarize, the use of labeling as a risk management tool must first be justified on a science-based foundation. There needs to be evidence that a risk exists, that risk management is warranted, and that labeling is an effective and proportionate measure to support that management and deliver a public health benefit. Once labeling is selected as the appropriate instrument, its expression should be consistent with food labeling principles. In most cases, food labels are intended to provide information rather than warnings, enable consumers to make informed choices. More directive statements, such as recommendations of use or recommendations against use, can be generally used for special categories of foods. Generally, these are reserved for what we call foods intended for specific population or groups, foods destined for special dietary uses, where more targeted guidance may be necessary to support safe and appropriate consumption of these particular products. In summary, good regulatory decision-making requires a clear justification for the regulatory instrument being used, including relatively simple measures such as labeling provisions. The choice of the instrument should be guided by principles of necessity, proportionality, and effectiveness. These same principles are highly relevant to food innovation. When regulatory measures are justified, proportionate to the level of risk, and carefully designed to achieve their objectives without creating unnecessary burdens, they contribute to an enabling environment that supports the safe and responsible development of food innovation. Okay, so now we're going to zero in on a couple of notions, and I'm going to go to the presentation that is there. And I would like also to seek your participation, because we would like to hear from you to learn from the regulatory framework that is applicable in Africa in particular. So you've heard this notion. Oh, there is a question? Yeah, please. So I'm just going to ask for a microphone. Mohammed, please.
Thank you very much, Prof, and the brilliant presentations that we have seen this afternoon. Particularly, I want to ask, with innovation, regulatory innovation, whether we take into account the environment. What I mean is the culture of the people for which that particular innovation is being proposed. So, for example, if you take Ghana, and then you look at labeling of foods, we will say that a product should have a name prescribed by law. And so if you take water, for example, you are required to specifically add to the name or the brand name of the product the statement that this is so Nestle ABC drinking water, all right, or natural mineral water. That those words, natural, mineral, water, is a description that you're giving to the product. And that should be on the principal panel that anyone who sees the product on the shelf will know that this is drinking water. All right. I was touched by this Nestle Pure Life. This particular water sits in front of us, Nestle Pure Life. And I'm asking myself, would this product sell in Ghana? And my colleague sitting right with me will say, no, will not allow this product with the name Nestle Pure Life, because in Ghana, we take into account the cultural understanding and then the interpretation that consumers give to names that they see on products and stuff like that. And so somebody will misinterpret Pure Life to assume that this product, when you take it, improves your general well-being or improves your life and things like that. And so the expression Pure Life will not go. Then I was asking myself, Egypt, for example, is a member of Codex. And all the Codex texts, when it comes to labeling, is also known to them. And so why will such a product sell in Egypt, but it will not sell in Ghana? And these are the regulatory challenges that you may have across the countries. And so when we're talking about innovation, and then we are looking at harmonization, I am also asking whether we should also take into account the environmental and the cultural differences that we have, and an understanding of names of things that we put on products and what they mean to the people who are going to consume that particular product. And that in itself can also serve as a barrier, okay, to facilitate trade across regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And your question has multiple layers, so I'm going to try to peel the layers as much as I can, okay? So I'll start actually maybe with some fundamentals, okay? And fundamentals about the Codex guidance, as you indicated, about food labeling. The Codex guidance is actually a set of general principles, okay? And I'm going to try to paraphrase the guidance, or at least, see what it means. When you look about food labeling, you have two categories of food labeling measures. You have the labeling that is mandated. What does this mean? It means that the regulator decides that there is part of the real estate of the label that I'm going to say that part, I'm not going to allow you to use it freely. I'm going to ask you to use it for certain purposes. For example, declaration of ingredients, date declarations, and other issues. Generally, the drivers for these mandatory requirements, they tend to be two elements. Necessity for the consumer to know. Second, a health rationale for that declaration. In both cases, those tend to be or have to be fully justified. So the necessity of information to know, some of them are basic, because basically, well, the consumer wants to know the composition of the product, because otherwise you're concealing something. That's a natural, and that's basically propagated since the 1960s, that food composition, ingredient declaration is one of the mandatory elements that you need to have on a food label. Date marking, however that is expressed, and that's why now you leave that to countries about some differences, but date marking is one of the elements that is mandatory. There are some elements, some key dates that the consumer needs to know: production dates, potentially best before dates, best before use date, and so on. So and those delimitations can have some variability. So you see, these are the mandatory elements, okay? And by the way, if I go for the mandatory elements related to a health rationale, I need to have a justification of that health rationale. So in other words, I'm going to give you an example. If we're going to be making nutrition labeling, before we arrived at putting nutrition labeling as a mandatory element, and you know that two countries in the world piloted that in the 1980s and 1990s, and those were Canada and the United States, starting with the United States, I have to admit that. And Canada actually was the second country to follow. It came from the realization that nutrition information is a key element for consumers to be able to make decisions in relation to prevention of non-communicable diseases. Okay? And that's why the categories of nutrients that were included are generally nutrients that have an impact on health. So you see, that's the mandatory element. Another example of mandatory element, I gave the example of contains phenylalanine. Okay. Another example of mandatory labeling is like, for example, in Canada, we have, when you have tenderized meat, so meat that is mechanically tenderized, we have an obligation to put that on the label. Why? Because when the meat is tenderized, it's more prone to bacterial contamination because the bacteria can enter inside. So the cooking measures have to be stronger. You have to go to higher temperatures. Okay? So that, if you don't have that information, the consumer wouldn't know, and maybe they will prepare a steak rare, like I like rare steak, and I would not cook it further. So I will be putting myself at risk. Okay? So you see, those are risk-driven mandatory provisions. The second element is discretionary labeling. Discretionary labeling. So what does this mean? It means that these are elements that the manufacturer wants to use and to put on their label in a discretionary manner. And here, let's not forget, who owns the real estate of the label? Who owns it? The manufacturer. The manufacturer owns the real estate of the label. So by virtue of freedom, the manufacturer decides what they do with that real estate and what they want to put on that real estate. What the regulator does is what? Creating rules and requirements for certain areas when that real estate is being used to convey some information. What are the principles that need to be applied? And this is where Codex intervenes. Codex intervenes with principles. The information should be clear. The information should not be misleading. And that's the key element. It's really the misleading information that warrants the biggest intervention. Okay? So if I take your example, and rightly so, there are some cultural elements that need to be accounted for in the way rules about labeling come out. Okay? And of course, cultural differences may lead to differences in the way some rules may be promulgated. But there are principles that need to be applied. In other words, you cannot be, as a regulator, for example, of a country, coming and saying, you know what, I don't like that type of labeling because my culture says it's different, where I don't have a pre-established precedent that shows that that cultural lens was applied across the board in other measures. That's one thing. Second element, I cannot be making requirements on the basis of supputations or hypothesis or potential perception. So in other words, I'm going to give you an example of that example that you just gave me, and I'm going to put myself in Canada because, and I'm really here sharing with you my experience, you know, as a regulator, where even though we are regulators and we are empowered, in Canada we have another body, and believe it or not, we have a parliamentary committee. The name of the parliamentary committee, you know what its name? It's the Parliamentary Committee on Scrutiny of Regulations. They spend their life making sure that the regulations that are issued within the principles of the legislation and the powers that were given. And that basically, as a regulator, we're not exceeding our powers. We're not, you know, overtaking our powers. So if I take the example that you mentioned, and if I had to say, or for example, I wanted to object to that statement on the label, the question that I will be asked will be right away, on what basis do you justify that the consumer will be perceiving that information in that fashion? Do you have focus grouping? Did you do focus testing? Do you have any data that supports that the interpretation of pure life will mean something else. And if we don't have any evidence that can support that, that would be an overpower or an overuse of the instrument of regulation. Because at the end of the day, these are what we call general claims. Basically, we have, general claims, general information. It's just actually, if as a regulator, I will be intervening in the choice of the name of the product. I could, if I go back to the example about, I like and I don't like, there are names that I don't like, right? So unless I have an evidence to show that that name is equivalent to a claim that is misleading, meaning some consequences will be observed as a result of that claim being put and potentially understood by the consumer, I don't have the right to intervene in the way the product is named. So this goes back, in fact, to the way we use regulations. Using the regulatory instrument is a powerful thing. And what I say powerful in the sense that it's not a light decision. It has so many repercussions. Why? Because when you decide to regulate, including to restrict, it means without, of course, there's the immediate consequence that whomever asked to use something will not be using it, okay? But the most immediate consequence is you have to enforce. You have to basically check that whatever you warranted is being applied. You have to make sure that there is fairness in the system, etc. All that means resources. So I cannot be using resources unless, one, there is justification, and that justification cannot be arbitrary. It has to be evidence-supported data that tells me that the consumer will perceive that product negatively. Because I cannot be there and say, I think that the consumer will not like this. I cannot have that. I think I basically get turned down immediately by, and in our case, basically the committee in question, and even we have another structure within the government of Canada that we call Treasury Board. Treasury Board, basically, this is a group that is reporting to the Prime Minister, because that's how our system is set. So it's the highest, authority in the country, and where they scrutinize every piece of rule that regulators come up with to make sure that there is consistency. The rule in transport, the rule in, water production, the rule in food regulation, the rule in pharmaceutical, the rule in cosmetic, that all those have similar foundations, because at the end of the day, these are rules by government, okay? So hence, by the way, the OECD requirements, and OECD requirements become our guidance. That's essentially the direction that we are using. So you see, in that element, I'm not saying I'm not saying it's yes or no. I would say that if you have the evidence that is clearly corroborated through focus testing, through consumer responses, that the response to that claim or to that statement will be with unforeseen consequences, that measure is justified. If, on the other hand, you do not have that data, that will be considered as an arbitrary decision and a restriction that is unjustified, at least in accordance with OECD rules, which are, again, not that it's OECD. At the end of the day, this is what we call for better regulations. So this brings me, I'm going to use your question. I don't know if I addressed some of the elements of the question there. I'm going to use this as a segue, essentially, for the discussion. So I'm going to go to, I left. So I'm going to use a notion that I actually spoke about, the instrument of choice. Okay, the instrument of choice of regulations. What do we mean by that? Because I said that in a number of instances in the little capsules. Instrument of choice. Basically, as a regulator, what is your primary mission? What is our primary mission? Well, I still consider myself a regulator, even though I left the government. Once a regulator, always a regulator. You stay, it's kind of the thinking that you have. So what is our primary mission? What is our primary mandate? Protect consumers, right? Primary mandate. That's what it is. Second mandate, fair practices in the food trade. That's actually the Codex mandate for everybody. We actually embrace that. We endorse that. Okay? So protecting consumers, what does this mean? It means managing the risk. A regulator is a risk manager, right? Okay, now, if you are managing the risk, you don't manage a risk with one instrument. You have a toolbox, generally, like you have a toolbox, and basically your role as a regulator, you look at your toolbox, which one I'm going to use? How do you decide which one you're going to use? Oh, because I like this one, I'm going to use this one. I like that one better, I'm going to use that one better. Or I've been using this one a lot, so therefore I'm going to use this one. No, you're going to be making an instrument of choice analysis. Okay? So in other words, you identified a risk, you identified an issue. Now you need to put in front of it measures. The measures can be regulatory measures, non-regulatory measures. Giving you an example. What is an example of a non-regulatory measure? What is the example of a non-regulatory measure? Education campaigns is a non-regulatory measure. Proactive engagement with industry. So essentially, I'm going to go to industry about sanitary production practices. That's actually a non-regulatory measure. I didn't go and actually say, thou shalt do this. No, I'm actually doing this on a voluntary basis, and I'm trying to do a culture propagation. So I have a best practice that I'm trying to propagate. Those are non-regulatory measures. Now, if I ask you which tool you will be privileging as a regulator, will you be using first a regulatory instrument or a non-regulatory instrument? Which is very much counterintuitive to the name that we have, which is a regulator. Which one shall I use first and why? I think we have a loss of adrenaline, eh? So we need to have replenishment of nutrients. We're getting to that very soon. So just bear with me, just, I would say 10 minutes more. So which tool will you be using first and why as a regulator? In your toolbox, you have regulatory tools, non-regulatory tools. Which one should you be using first, or should you be selecting first? Regulatory, why? Because I'm a regulator, right? That's the answer. And that's why I'm saying it's counterintuitive. In fact, the first instrument I should privilege is the non-regulatory measure. Why? Why? Using a regulatory instrument is costly, very costly. You're going to be developing a regulation. You're going to be implementing it. You're going to be ensuring that the industry complies with it. You're going to have enforcement strategies. All of that is money. Okay? All of that is investment. All of that is restrictions. Okay, but that's the thing. I didn't say which instrument you should only use. No, I said which instrument you should think of first. The first option is the non-regulatory option, because it will be considered. Okay, but that's the thing. I'm going to go actually, you know what, Dr. Mirvat, I'm going to actually take your idea here and take it even further. And we're discussing, because we are amongst, regulators and exchanging ideas. What is the utopic state of a food regulatory regime? Utopia. I'm in utopia. The best state of a food regulatory regime. The best state of a food regulatory regime is when the one that is regulated, which is the industry, is complying with everything. And me as a regulator, I'm setting the rules and the requirements, but you know what? I have the lightest touch. Basically, when I intervene the least, that's utopia. It means that everything is working. I set the requirements. Everybody understands the roles, the responsibilities, their duties, their obligations, their privileges, etc. And everything is working like, like a clock work. And basically me as a regulator, I'm watching, I'm overseeing, and I'm not touching. That's utopia. That's what I need to aspire towards. Because a system that is based with, or that is based upon, and again, I mean, this is what we do even in our families with our children, Utopia, what I want is that my child follows the best rules, the best applications without me being behind him all the time or behind her all the time, right? Because if I'm behind her all the time, I'm basically failing in the education, and it's so drastically exhausting. Okay, I guess I'm speaking maybe for many parents here. So in other words, the non-regulatory tool should be the primary tool that I will use because it's the one that technically is the easier to implement. It's easier to implement. I'm conveying, I'm propagating, etc. But I agree with you. That may not work. And in fact, that may not work for one reason, for one particular reason. It might be unevenly applied. Some good actors will be applying it. Some bad actors will not be applying it. In fact, that can lead to something. The good actors will come to you as a regulator and say, you know what? I'm tired of having a bad reputation because of these guys. I want a rule. I want something that creates an even environment. And then you actually consider the regulatory instrument. I'm not saying that that's the trigger. What I wanted to convey to you is that using the instrument of regulation is not a light decision. It is something that needs to be justified and corroborated by a need. The risk needs to be sufficiently significant that I decided that my other instruments will not work, and I have demonstrated that they may not work, because people, unfortunately, we are humans, we don't always listen and we don't always follow, and there will always be ones that will be wanting to contravene, and therefore, we identified that by putting a particular rule in place that is enforceable in the form of a regulation, I have a higher likelihood of addressing the risk or addressing the issue. So the choice of the regulatory instrument needs to be justified. That's what I meant to tell you. It needs to be justified. It needs to be so justified, by the way, that in my world, which is always has been a nightmare, I have always to have a justification for every regulatory decision that I'm going to be making, including the risk assessment, the risk analysis. Why am I doing this? Because this is the risk that I need to protect. Second, that basically the measure is proportionate to the level of risk. So I need to do a cost-benefit analysis. And I need to even have an initial appreciation of a demonstration of effectiveness. What I'm proposing is most likely to address the issue. So going back even to the example about, the labeling, I decided that that labeling doesn't work. Well, I have to show that really I consider the consumer will be misled with that or will be interpreting that in a completely different thing, which may have a repercussion on him. It's not also liking or not liking. It's actually, there is a repercussion for the understanding of that particular statement, okay? Now, in this risk paradigm, what I wanted to use in here is also to say that this is the risk arrow, and this is the instrument of choice of higher oversight. As we said, most food need to be managed with a post-market oversight. Post-market oversight meaning that I set some rules, some requirements. In this case, actually, they are compulsory requirements, so they are regulations. Okay, and I decided that they could only work with regulations, only propagation doesn't work, okay? So maximum limits of contaminants, MRLs for pesticides, certain labeling requirements, etc. These are post-market rules. So long that these post-market rules are fulfilled, the product can enter the market and you don't have to come and ask my permission to come to the market. when the risk increases. Example, uncertainty increases. History of use or safe use is not fully corroborated. Potentially, it can be also a double risk like the infant formula situation that I used. It's basically a food that is destined to the most vulnerable subset of the population. And potentially, when it's used for mothers that cannot breastfeed, it's going to be a sole source. Therefore, higher risk. Therefore, I might be mandating a pre-market oversight. For novel foods, for novel ingredients, I'm going to be doing the same thing. Okay? So I'm going to even give you another example for health claims. And here I'm going back to the example of our colleagues from Ghana. So for health claims, are all claims equivalent? That's what I'm going to ask you. What is the issue about a health claim? Two issues. Issue number one, the most important, health repercussions. Meaning that if the claim is not fulfilled, there is a health repercussion. Okay, because the claim is a statement, and if I'm reading it, I might be taking action upon it as a consumer. If the claim is not fulfilled and it has a repercussion on my health, that's high risk, right? In comparison to another claim, I don't know, pure life, you know what? The health consideration on that one, not big, okay? But it's not only health, okay? The second one is fraud. Fraud meaning misleading the consumer. You're telling them something, and that can be also an economic impact. So it's not only health impact, it's also economic impact, okay? So I'm going to give you the examples of trying to tier the system based on risk. I'm going to give you a claim related to reduces blood cholesterol. And blood cholesterol levels are a risk factor of heart disease or cardiovascular even disease. We can say that. That's claim number one. Claim number two, whitens teeth or helps in whitening teeth. Two claims. I'm a regulator. I'm going to be deciding which one I should subject to pre-market oversight, or should I subject them both to pre-market oversight? Discussion here, and give me your ideas. Dr. Mirvat.
I think help or support, this will be a healthy claim, but reduce is a therapeutic claim.
Okay. Though those are technicalities, so absolutely, and I agree with that. So let's say I'm speaking about helps reduce, so really the tamed version of the claim, but nonetheless, I'm speaking about blood cholesterol. Okay, so between that one and helps or contributes to teeth whitening, which one I should submit to pre-market oversight? Should I submit them both? Should I make a difference, and why? Let's discuss it, yes? Whitening teeth is what? Less dangerous. Okay, why is it less dangerous?
Because cholesterol will be introduced to the patient who suffers from hypertension or high cholesterol level. So it will be more dangerous than whitening teeth, which is not a privilege for anyone.
Okay. So when we say more dangerous, what do we mean by more dangerous? Basically, I have to see what is the repercussion when the health claim is not fulfilled, right?
Yes.
Because they're making a claim, right? So the repercussion that I would be looking at is they say something, what if it's not happening? Whitening teeth. I'm a consumer, I'm going to use product, okay, for whatever reason, and then whitening teeth, I'm going to use it first day, second day, third week. I'm going to look at my teeth in the mirror, you know, I don't see any change. What do you think I will do? I'll stop using the product.
Yes.
Any health repercussions on me? Absolutely none. Okay. The second one.
High risk claim.
The second one, if I read that one, I might be actually talking to my health professional. I'm going to say, you know what? I'm using this amount of statins. What if I use, I don't know, more of this product and I introduce it more in my diet? And basically there is even a dose that is actually, you know, mandated in order to induce the claim. How about I reduce my dosage of statins? What happens if the claim doesn't work? A problem. I actually made a health-altering decision on the basis of that claim. So the claim number, I don't know now, if I say the number one, which is the cholesterol one versus the teeth whitening one, that's higher risk than the second one. So I could argue as a regulator that claim number one is subject to pre-market oversight. You will not put that on the label unless you come to me and you justify according to set of requirements. And I actually am convinced with the evidence, of course, on the basis of risk analysis, that what you're saying is fulfilled. Claim number two, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say, you know what? No pre-market oversight. But does this mean that he's free for all? No. I can go, and if I see that proliferating on the market, on a post-market monitoring basis, I have the authority to ask you for any information that you put on your label, by what information you supported it. If you do not provide me with that information, you are in infraction. So I'm not making that a mandatory pre-market, but I am actually making it on a post-market demonstration basis. Okay? Now, if I want to create more predictability in that system, what will I do? In a post-market based regime. So because I don't want to be, chasing non-compliance, I can develop a guidance document as to how that claim can be used. So basically, if I monitor you afterwards, and I see that you did not comply, you don't tell me that you didn't know. I gave you guidance. But you see the difference of resources? One is pre-market resource. Every file has to be approved. The second one is post-market monitoring. That's a fundamental difference in the regulatory implementation stance. Fundamental difference. Fundamental difference in the cost, fundamental difference in the repercussions. But it doesn't mean that the second one is not required to be fulfilled. It has to be fulfilled because at the end of the day, that's the integrity of the food regulatory system. And the integrity of the food regulatory system has always to be maintained. Okay? No matter what, by the way, any regulatory provision or any requirements, as long as there is a breach in the protection of consumers, whether be it for health or the economy, the economic well-being of the consumer, anything that can lead to breaches can actually be hurtful to the integrity of the food regulatory system. It's just what instrument I use in order to apply that. So I'm saying all this, and I know we're getting close. I arrived and even went beyond my 10 minutes by another 10 minutes. Basically, these are considerations that you need to consider to put in your mind when you are applying that also to innovation. But if they are not already enshrined in your system for existing elements, you will have issues when you implement that subsequently. Okay, we've arrived at 2:30 p.m. and I think even though we got a health break, but I think probably reached a saturation of what can be received at this point. So we have an agenda, I know, and we are probably beyond the agenda element, but the agenda is there as a guide, and as long as we are progressing, that's what we want, okay? So what I'm going to suggest is that we take the lunch break, we come back, and when we come back, I will be proposing some adjustments to the agenda and how we're going to be spending the remainder of the afternoon, and potentially also how the remainder of the capacity building activity will continue. I have a proposal in that regard. So again, thanking you for your attention and for bearing with me for these last 2 hours, and I'm going to wish you a bon appetit. Thank you. So we try to come back around 3:30, okay? Lunch is going to be at the main restaurant at Evo, and everybody has, you should have your little voucher, okay, to access the lunch. So bon appetit, everyone.